your warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming this evening. It shows at least you're prepared to put up with a little suffering by attending this lecture on this warm evening. I've been asked to talk about what I regard as the hardest question. It's the hardest question for me as a Christian. I believe it's the hardest question for the atheist or the pantheist. It's the hardest question for every human being. How do we fit our experience and our observation of pain and suffering into whatever worldview we've come to espouse over the years? And because suffering and pain are extremely real, it's obvious that any facile attempts to give the solution will be greeted very rightly with extreme suspicion. I don't feel I can give the solution, not in that sense. And what I'm going to try to share with you as best I can are certain of the ideas that have helped me to come to terms with this whole problem area, both at the level of the intellect and also at the level of experience. Although I am painfully aware that to have someone addressing you who is rather frightened of going to the dentist is not an impressive record when it comes to dealing with serious suffering. There are two stories. There's the inside story and there's the outside story, which lead to two perspectives. It's one thing to suffer. It's another thing to observe the suffering and not be directly affected by it. Cancer, for instance, looks very different to the young woman who's just been told she's got 3 months to live, from how the very same cancer looks to the professor of oncology who tells her that information. And so there's an inside story and an outside story, and they are very different, although they overlap. Intellectual analysis on the one hand, counselling on the other. We need both. We all want intellectual clarity. But as we know, no amount of reason can penetrate a veil of tears. How does one bring sense? Or if not sense, some hope in situations that are devastating, overwhelming, and irreversible? You can mend a broken leg, you cannot mend a lost child. You can't replace a lost relative or friend. I've lost my wife, I lost my dad, I've lost my child. How often we hear these things coming from a heart that's overflowing with pain and questions. Why did it happen to them? Or why did they get killed and I got spared? As I was told on arrival in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake that killed so many people. Where can I find hope? Or is the quest for hope simply irrational sentimentality because there is no hope? And best we can do is patch things up and move on. Now, as a Christian, I observe that the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, do not avoid this problem. In fact, they raise it in different forms. One of the stories we're told is the experience of a brother and 2 sisters. And the brother is very ill, and the sisters send a message to Jesus to come. And he doesn't come. And the brother Lazarus dies. And when he eventually does come, they remonstrate with him. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And the reaction of the crowd is very interesting. Some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And that's the question that many people face. Could God not had made the world in such a way that it did not damage people? Couldn't he have given us bodies that never went wrong? Could God have made a sun that had warmed us but didn't burn us? Could he have made fire and electricity that wasn't dangerous, and an earth that didn't quake? Now, those comments lead me to make a second division. There are two sources of pain and suffering. And we need to distinguish the logical distinct sources, although they are often inextricably intertwined. The first is suffering and pain that men and women inflict on each other. And this is normally known as the problem of moral evil. The second is suffering and pain that's caused without apparent human involvement. Natural disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, diseases like brain tumours and cancer. And that is often called the problem of pain or natural evil. And as potent symbols of each of these, we might think of two cathedrals, Coventry in England and Christchurch in New Zealand. They illustrate the two problems very well. We look at their ruins and we see two things. One, we see traces of former beauty, the original design and tracery and elegant architecture that was in the building as first put up. And then we see the scars of catastrophe. In other words, those buildings present a mixed picture of beauty on the one hand and of destruction and scarring on the other. The cathedral in Coventry, of course, was bombed, so humans were involved in it. The cathedral at Christchurch was damaged by a devastating earthquake in which human beings were not involved. So, two cathedrals, two sides of the very same question. And for many people, that picture represents life. There are traces of beauty in this universe, magnificent. Just looking at the clouds as I was driving along this evening, and the sheer beauty and power of the heavens, or watching last night on television the behavior of the red cranes of Japan in their magnificent dance, and it causes you to worship. And yet, the pictures of ISIS, the pictures of hungry and deprived people trying to get somewhere to live, and so on. We're faced every day, ladies and gentlemen, with beauty and barbed wire, as I put it. It's raw. And I'm also aware that in a large audience like this tonight, there are people who are feeling very raw. And I hope that I will be very aware of them as I proceed. Now, I've separated the two ideas of moral evil and natural evil, but they are frequently conjoined, because one can lead to the other. Greed can lead to deforestation, that can lead to starvation of the following generation, and so on. And it's very interesting that one of the most ancient doctrines, one of the most ancient pieces of literature that deals with the problem of suffering, the book of Job in the Bible, which is dated very early, conjoins the two problems in the experience of Job. It's interesting to note that the devastations that fell upon him were of two kinds. First of all, his children were attacked by the Sabaeans, that's moral evil. There then fell fire on them from heaven, possibly a volcanic explosion. That is natural evil. There then came the Chaldeans, moral evil again, and finally a tornado hit them, causing devastation and death. And so in that highly compressed text, you have alternation between the two possible sources of pain and suffering. And in one of the comments that Christ made on the falling of a tower in Jerusalem, he made the point, do you think that the people on whom the Tower of Siloam fell were sinners above all other sinners? I tell you not. And then he goes on immediately to talk about the people whose blood Pilate mingled with their sacrifices by executing them while they were performing their temple duties. Again, it's the problem of pain, the falling of a tower. No one apparently had anything to do with it, and the problem of moral evil resulting from human involvement. So it's a very complex situation that we face. Pain, which features in suffering, of course, has a very important role to play, as any medic will tell us. It warns us of danger, so that if a normally healthy human being places their hand too near the fire, the nervous system functions and tells the brain to remove the hand. Some people haven't got that facility, and therefore are in danger of injuring themselves without realizing it. And a certain amount of pain is involved in our development. For instance, if you take the English war game called rugby, you will find that people are prepared to put up with almost any amount of pain to get playing for their country. And any sport has this. Any physical sport involves a great deal of pain and stress. And following that line, it is quite obvious from experience of literature and actual experience of people that suffering and pain can make a very deep contribution to character formation. It was Dostoevsky who said once that he could not imagine a great person who had not suffered. And we all know cases of resilience and fortitude in the face of suffering that have molded character of great quality. Let me just fix this thing. And sometimes even as parents, we will allow a child to go through a painful experience that we feel as parents, we're not always right, of course, that will profit them in the end. Now that's all very well. This is not very strong. Where shall I let it go? That's all very well. But all of us know that as we look out in our world, there is a significant, a huge amount of evil that is so overwhelming that it is completely incommensurate with those goals. Would it be better if I used this, do you think? Okay, let's try that. C.S. Lewis, who's well known for two important books on these issues, The Problem of Pain and A Grief Observed, once wrote in a letter, "It's so difficult to believe that the travail of all creation, which God himself descended to share, may be necessary in the process of turning finite creatures with free wills into gods. It's also hard to believe that earthquakes, famines, epidemics, Auschwitz and the killing fields are required for that." So how do we react to it? Well, of course, we react within the presuppositions that govern our worldviews. Some react as theists, affirming faith in God. For example, in New Zealand, I met people in the face of the earthquake who were saying things like, quoting Psalm 46, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way, and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Though its waters foam and roar, and the mountains quake with their surging. Though the mountains fall into the heart of the sea," a kind of earthquake. Others do not react like that. They react as pantheists, holding those who suffer that they do so because of their sin in a previous existence. And this suffering helps them to work off their karma, and therefore there's no point in relieving their pain. Since if you reduce that pain, you will only be reducing you'll only be increasing what they have to go through in a future life to work off that karma. Others will say, well, earthquakes are a judgment of God. And indeed, people of various religions suggested that in the case both of the earthquake in New Zealand and the tsunamis in Japan. And of course, Others think that the obvious solution is atheism. Surely they hold earthquakes, the existence of horrible diseases, of the Holocaust and 9/11 show that there is no God. And we must just face the fact that that's the way the universe is, hard and unfeeling, caring nothing for whether we live or die. Now, these questions have occupied human minds for millennia. As the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, who's often quoted, pointed out, referring to Greek philosophy in the 3rd century BC, he said, Epicurus's old questions are yet unanswered. Is he, God, willing to prevent evil but not able? Then is he impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? And the questionings of Job are even older than that. Bertrand Russell, like Hume, took his cue from Epicurean philosophy, this time as represented by the 1st century BC Latin poet Lucretius, who wrote the brilliant poem De Rerum Natura on the nature of the physical universe that I believe everybody who's interested in science ought to read, but that's a different story, that had considerable influence in the thinking of people like Machiavelli, in the Renaissance and so on. My view on religion, said Russell, is that of Lucretius. I regard it as a disease born of fear and as a source of untold misery to the human race. And now is beginning an analysis which is very popular in the West these days, that religion is actually part of the problem, not of the solution. And we need to take that on board. Friedrich Nietzsche, wrote in his book, The Antichrist, I condemn Christianity. I bring against the Christian church the most terrible of all accusations that an accuser has ever had in his mouth. It is, to me, the greatest of all imaginable corruptions. It seeks to work the ultimate corruption, the worst possible corruption. The Christian church has left nothing untouched by its depravity. It has turned every value into worthlessness and every truth into a lie and every integrity into baseness of soul. Richard Dawkins didn't quite put it like that, but he did say in Der Spiegel that 9/11 had, I quote, radicalized him. My last vestige of hands-off religion respect disappeared in the smoke and choking dust of September 11, 2001. Followed by the National Day of Prayer, when prelates and pastors did their tremulous Martin Luther King impersonation and urged people of mutually incompatible faiths to hold hands, united in homage to the very force that had caused this problem in the first place. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement of what is such a simple logic that people find it very appealing. Imagine with John Lennon, says Dawkins, a world without religion. Imagine no suicide bombers, no 9/11, no 7/7, no crusades, no witch hunts, and so on. No Northern Ireland. How anybody could imagine no Northern Ireland, I just I don't know. But nevertheless, that's what he said. And that reaction, that religion is the evil, we do actually need to face. In a world where there are many wars going on at the moment which arguably have a religious base for their violence. And I face this a lot, having mentioned Northern Ireland. Coming from there, people say, how could you possibly, I mean, step number one that you ought to face is the fact that your country has been riven by religious violence. So please don't tell me that there's any solution in the direction of religion from the problem of pain and suffering. So I'm just going to mention that very briefly and give you my reaction to it. Now, the situation in my home country is much more complex than simply religious war, as any sensible historian will tell you. But the popular view is that it's a fight between two segments of Christianity. What do I think of it? I'm ashamed of it. That's what I think of it. Utterly ashamed of it. Utterly ashamed, in fact, that the name of Christ has ever been associated with a bomber and AK-47. But I want to explain to you why I'm ashamed of it. And the reason is very simple. And this is where history is enormously important. You see, in my debate with Christopher Hitchens, he started off for about 15 minutes in the Edinburgh Festival talking about the evils of religion. And I responded by saying, Christopher, you're absolutely right. I react against that like you do. And later, privately, I said to him, Christopher, I don't understand you really. I suspect you haven't really read the New Testament. Well, he was slightly shocked at that. And he said, why do you think that? Well, I said, you know, if you had, you would have noticed that Jesus sets himself against the very things you set yourself against. Religion that's exploitative of the poor. Religion that's bigoted and extreme. Religion that's promoting violence. I said, had you never noticed that one of the most famous, if not the most famous trial in history was where Jesus was accused of the very thing you're accusing Christianity of. That is fomenting political violence. Had you not noticed he was declared innocent of the charge? And I said that's enormously important. Because when Pilate investigated Jesus, he was very keen to find out whether Jesus was a political and therefore violent threat to the Roman occupation. And Jesus looked at him and said, well, I am a king, yes, but not in the way you think. My kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would have been fighting. To this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And Pilate reacted in the famous words, which might not be as cynical as some folks think, what is truth? And went out and declared Jesus innocent. Why? Because he could see, ladies and gentlemen, as easily as we can see, that the one thing you cannot do with force and violence is impose truth on people. Especially if it's truth about God's forgiveness, peace with God, eternal life, living peaceably among your neighbours and for them, and so on. And it's very important, I think, to go back in the historical documents if you want to understand what Christianity is saying on this topic, and realize that those that take up guns and weapons for Christ or his message aren't following him, they're disobeying him explicitly. He told his disciples not to take up weapons. And I cannot help mentioning what happened when one of them did. The Apostle Peter famously wasn't a good swordsman, and when they came to arrest Jesus, he took a sword and he took a swipe at the head of the high priest's servant, and he managed to cut the man's ear off. And Jesus put it back on. Now, to discuss why I believe that Jesus actually could and did do that is outside my remit tonight. But if you have a little bit of literary imagination, you'll see the message that's behind that. I've noticed in this world that if you take weapons to defend God or Christ, what you will do very effectively is cut the ears off. And they won't listen anymore. And one of the biggest difficulties I often face, coming from where I do, but not only, is nobody's interested in listening because their ears have been cut off. So I sometimes jokingly say I'm in the ear repair business, and it's a very difficult business to carry out. So that's the point I would want to make. Other religions, of course, must defend themselves against similar accusations. So this very simplistic idea that all the evil is due to religion is simply false, and it obscures another major issue, and we'll come to that just in a moment. In life's experience, I have met people who have experienced very deep suffering indeed, of a kind that I have no parallel to. I've been in Auschwitz many times. and I wept every time that I've been there. And many of my Jewish friends have lost their relatives and their friends in Auschwitz, and when I get to know them deeply, they often will say to me, you know, we're sorry, but please, please don't talk to us about the existence of a personal God. If you like, as a scientist, to say there's evidence of design in the universe, the laws of nature, the fine-tuned constant of nature, the fact that we can study the universe in the language of mathematics, okay, that may well give some evidence of some designing intelligence, but please, please, don't insult me by talking to me about a personal God who loves the world. That just goes too far. I see no evidence of that. So we must ask this question. I sympathize deeply with people who turn to atheism because of their experience of pain and suffering. But now I want to probe a little bit. I want to follow people that are taking that path and raise a number of questions that I think are important. Suppose now there is no God, and the universe is just as it is. It's a product of time and chance, the forces of nature, the laws of nature, wherever they came from, and so on. But now, if that is the case, where do the concepts of good and evil come from? Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote in a very famous book, The Brothers Karamazov, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. Now, of course, he didn't mean that atheists were not moral people. Indeed, atheists could put theists to shame. From where I stand, and let me make this very clear, every man and woman is of infinite value, being made in the image of God, whether they believe in Him or not, and therefore they are moral beings and capable of moral action and moral decision, and capable of putting some people that think that they know God better than they do to shame. So I'm leaving that completely aside. Dostoevsky was suggesting something deeper. That if God doesn't exist, the concepts of good and evil dissolve. Now here's the supreme irony for me, and Richard Dawkins is probably the most vocal on it, so I'll quote him. Here's the logic of his moral and ethical position. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. And we dance to its music. That's the end of all morality, of course. There's no good, there's no evil, there's no justice. But now comes my problem. Why is Richard Dawkins so upset by 9/11, which he judges as the worst of moral evil? Is it true that the young men who flew the jet planes into the Twin Towers were simply dancing to their DNA? Well, if they were, then who could blame them? Because they're simply deterministic robots. So we have a problem. Outrage against moral evil presupposes a standard of good that is objectively real and independent of us, so that we expect others to agree with us when we condemn actions like those of ISIS or 9/11. And so there is a real question here, to my mind. If there's no transcendence and no God, then can there be such an objective standard of good? And if there is no moral evil or good, the concept of morality disappears and moral outrage is observed. Charles Taylor, who wrote a very interesting book called This Secular Age, agrees with the point I'm making here. The modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. And the irony, to my mind, the supreme irony, is that the very morality that many of the new atheists and others use to condemn 9/11 is in the Bible itself. So it's totally consistent with the idea that there is a God. And if we lose faith in God, the future would seem to me to be very bleak, because how shall we then defend our valued freedoms on the basis of a moral relativism that remains when we lose an anchor in the transcendent? So, my first point, the intellectual point, is that if you follow the atheist route, you have difficulty with the very categories you're using to formulate the problem of evil and suffering. The other thing that the accusations that are made against religion in general and Christianity in particular obscure is that religion hasn't been the only source of suffering and pain. John Lennon's song that was quoted, "Imagine a world without 9/11 in Northern Ireland," and so on. Well, you've probably noticed, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not John Lennon, I'm John Lennox. And the difference of the single letter is significant. I've written a song too. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing it. It's called Imagine. Imagine a world without Mao, Stalin, or Pol Pot. What about that world? It strikes me that many of our atheist friends, Dawkins and Co in particular, are completely silent about that world. Completely silent about the connection between the fundamental atheism enshrined in Marxism and the rivers of blood that flowed in the 20th century. There's been immense suffering caused by extremist ideologies of both left and right. And that is admitted by the majority of people, it seems to me, particularly historians. John Gray writes very interestingly about it. So we need to face that as well. Then I come back to my question. Could God not have created us without the capacity for moral evil? Could God not have foreseen it would all go wrong and avoided it? Surely a God who's all-powerful could have prevented all this horrendous evil and suffering simply by creating beings incapable of doing evil. I'm going to face that head on. Could God have made beings like that? Of course. He's made many of them, and so can we. You've heard of robots, haven't you? We can make them. They're not moral beings. They cannot sin in that sense. And of course, you can empty the world of evil by creating beings that are non-moral. And we can make worlds like that, as I say, either in real space or in virtual space. And here I come to something that I believe carries a lot of weight, although it's a very, very ancient argument. In a world where good and evil were non-categories, where pain and suffering were impossible, in such a world there would be no humans. Because part of our essential humanity, as I understand it, that magnificent gift that I believe God has given all of us, is an ability to say yes or no. The ability to say yes is meaningless if you've no capacity to say no. And talking to people, ask them what is the joy of their marriage. Well, she said yes to me, and she stuck with it for years, and I said yes to her. Relationships are only possible when there's a real arena of freedom and possibility. So I often say to people, in wishing for the ideal world in which things cannot happen that are damaging, you're actually wishing yourself out of existence. The problem is that God has taken an immense risk in making the world that we have here. It's interesting, isn't it, when you think about it? Many of us in this room have children, And I can remember when my first little girl was born and I held her in my arms. And I thought, you know, I brought you into the world. You could grow up to say no to me. And many parents have experienced that, haven't they? Rejection, either from their children or their siblings or their parents. And it leaves very deep psychological scars. Why have children then, ladies and gentlemen? Why would you have children? Well, we all know the answer to that. We know that it could go wrong, but the very thing that creates the possibility of it going wrong creates the possibility of it going right in a way that it couldn't go right if that facility, that capacity did not exist. And so it seems to me there's something very deep about what's called the free will argument here. That God has honored us, let me put it that way, by giving us an inconceivable gift. He's giving us genuine freedom and delegated responsibility. He allows me to bring up my child. Me with all my imperfections and all the rest of it, but giving me real responsibility and treating me as a real moral being. And in that lies human dignity, of course. And so those things we prize and value, when you follow them back, their very existence, seems to me it's unavoidable, raises the possibility that the negative will happen. Now, C.S. Lewis has written brilliantly about this long ago. He said if we lived in a world where if you used a stick to prop up a building, it stayed firm, but if you took it and were going to hit your neighbour with it, it turned into rubber. In the end, your freedom would be removed. You'd be back in the robotic world. There'd be no humans in it, nor would there be any humanity. So, putting it bluntly, if we don't wish to be degraded to the level of machines, if we want to be treated as moral agents of real value, then it seems to me that it's absolutely logical. We cannot avoid the fact that bad things can happen. Now, you'll have noticed that that argument says nothing about natural disasters and pain. The argument of free will is by definition something to do with humans, and therefore the aspect of the difficulty that it faces is the question of moral evil. But what about natural disasters? I was faced by this very suddenly when I was on a flight to New Zealand, because I just heard about the earthquake in Christchurch and I offered not to come. And they said, oh, but you must come, but I'm afraid you'll have to change the title of every talk, because the only title you'll be allowed to address are variations of the theme, why earthquakes? And it was a very deeply moving experience to meet people who lost their husbands a few days before, and to be faced with the biggest crowd in a church that New Zealand had seen for many, many years. Now, very oddly, just a month or two before, I'd been reading a very interesting book by geologist Peter Ward and an astronomer David Brownlee called Rare Earth. And it had a chapter that caught my attention for some reason. And I'm glad it did, because it was called The Surprising Importance of Plate Tectonics. And its argument was that if the Earth's tectonic plates ceased to move, there would be eventually mass extinction of life on Earth. And life as we know it would stop. Apparently, plate tectonics is essential for the formation of continents and maintenance of the balance between the earth and sea. It acts as a global thermostat. It's responsible for maintaining water liquid for a period of roughly 4 billion years, and so on and so forth. And their conclusion is this: it may be that plate tectonics is a central requirement for life on a planet, and that it is necessary for keeping a world supplied with water. Now what do we do? Now what do we do? Because the earthquake in Christchurch was, as the dean of the cathedral there said at the time, was just the earth doing what the earth does. The fault, if anything, was building homes where there is a fault line. Now, it's all very well saying that if you know where the fault line is, but if you don't know where it is. So this just compounds the issue. And I ask it again, couldn't God have made an earth which didn't need plate tectonics? Which didn't need these mechanisms? And we can go on and on and on and on, as I mentioned before. So it is very difficult. Now, an earthquake is a huge violence in the surface of the earth caused by subterranean fire and volcanic activity. And of course it captures our attention because the loss of life is often very high, as with tsunamis. But we need to bring this down because we can have our personal earthquakes, can't we? You're told you've got cancer. You're told you've got a brain tumor. There's been an earthquake in your heart or in your brain. And you see, when those kind of things hits us, as far as we are concerned, they are as big and as devastating as a major earthquake in the actual earth. Because now we are the ones who are directly hit. And this creates difficulties. If you forgive a personal reference, a few years ago, about 8, I was not expected to live for more than a few seconds because I had a little earthquake in my heart. And the JR worked fast and saved my life. And people say, well, isn't that wonderful? You thank God as a Christian. I said, well, let me tell you about my sister, who at the very same time lost her daughter of 22, just married, with an earthquake in the brain in the form of a tumor. She's a Christian too. You're saying I should thank God for how they fixed my heart. What are you going to say to my sister? That's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. It's so easy to be grateful, isn't it, for the good things that happen to us. It's so difficult for someone like my sister, who still years afterwards is trying to work this out and to make sense of her own personal earthquake. Now let me come to the central point. I have, like many of you, spent far too much time during my student days sitting up half the night trying to solve Epicurus' problem. Surely a good God and an all-powerful God may have gone round and round and round and round. But I've made an observation. I'm getting older now. I've never yet met anybody who came to a satisfactory conclusion after such an argument. Have you? Now that I find very interesting. This has been going on for centuries, and nobody seems to get anywhere with it. So I thought, you know, we mathematicians are funny people sometimes. If we've been bashing our heads on a question for 500 or 600 years, we usually give it time, and find we can't answer them, we try to change the question to see we can make some progress with a question that's hopefully capable of solution. I want to suggest another question. It isn't an easy question either, but it's this. What we're faced with, however long we've argued and debated about this problem, is beauty and barbed wire. It's a mixed picture. It's a mixed picture for everybody, but some have more of the beauty and others have far too much of the barbed wire. So whatever we say has to take into account the sheer raggedness and rawness of the mixture that faces us. Now, we've seen that following the atheist route creates philosophical problems. It also creates practical problems. I've said to many an atheist friend who said that's just how it is. Well, I said, you imagine you solved the problem of suffering. I'm not sure that I see it that way, because actually you've got rid of something that I still have. And what's that? Hope. By definition, if there is no God, death is the end. And therefore the vast majority of human beings will have suffered without hope, and worse still, if I might say so, they are denied every possibility of ultimate justice. Listen to Dawkins. There is no good, there is no evil, there is no justice. So they've solved the problem of evil, have they? I have still huge difficulty, but I've real hope, because I feel there's a question we can ask and pursue far enough to actually make a difference, both at the intellectual and the personal level. I'm going to finish with it. And it's this. Granted that out of the twin problems of moral evil and natural evil, we see a ragged, mixed view, beauty and barbed wire. My question is this: is there any evidence anywhere that there is a God that you could trust with that? Let me repeat the question. Is there any evidence anywhere that there is a God that you could trust with that? To such an extent that even if you go to death with unresolved questions, as most of us will, that you could still hold on to that. Is there any evidence? And I believe there is, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm just going to make one or two points. At the heart of Christianity, as you know, is a cross. The central Christian claim, now you may not agree with it, of course, but if you want to know what Christianity says about these things, it's good to listen to what it says before you judge it. And what it says is that Christ was actually God incarnate. That's a big thing to take on board in this scientific world, but I hope the last few lectures have opened your minds to the possibility of doing that. And if that's God on a cross, so to speak, it raises the question, what is God doing on a cross? If that suffering had been the end, we'd have never heard of it. But it was not the end, because the message that set Jerusalem buzzing that first Easter, that riveted the philosophers of Athens, was that Jesus had conquered death by being raised from the dead by the power of God. And as Paul addressed the most famous philosophical court of his age, he used that resurrection as a space-time event which says God has appointed a day in which he is going to judge the world, and thus, of course, solve the problem of ultimate justice. That wasn't a negative message, it was a wonderful message. The human heart cries for justice. I think of that every time as I stand outside the gas chambers in Auschwitz. Is there any answer to the screams of those women and children that echo over the years since that happened? Is there anything, any hope? And the answer, it seems to me, is yes, there is. If it's actually true that God has visited our planet in Christ, and that he's died and risen again, it means that death is not the end. And if he's going to be the personal judge, the one who has suffered, can we trust him? That's the question. Can we trust him? And in order to answer that question, we need to investigate the nature of his character and his attitude to human beings, his love for them, his care for them. And the wonderful thing is, ladies and gentlemen, if this is true, the terrorists are not going to get away with it. Hitler, gassing 6 million Jews and millions of other people, just took a gun, blew his brains out. Well, if atheism is true, he won. He lived quite a long life. He had all the power he wanted, he had everything. Is that the story of the universe? Well, it is if there's no God. But if there is a God, then this historic record comes into its own and tells us that justice will be done. Now, in my experience, people don't like talk about judgment. It's very odd, isn't it? Our heart cries for justice, but somehow we feel that if God were to poke too closely into my life, he might discover things that are quite disturbing. And that's absolutely true, of course. It's so easy to feel that we're on one side of the divide and most other people are on the other. But you see, the sheer genius of Christianity, if I may put it that way, is that the whole mechanism of declaration and evidence that Christ is the final judge, coming through a cross and a resurrection, deals with that problem of encounter. Because the fundamental message is this, that if I'm prepared to trust him, that's the key. That's the heart of my question. Could we trust God with it? If I'm prepared to trust him, then he is prepared to grant me forgiveness here and now, to grant me what he calls eternal life and peace with God, and a new power to live. And ladies and gentlemen, many people say to me, you're a scientist, you know, you shouldn't take Christianity seriously because it isn't testable. I'm amazed how that idea has got around. Of course it's testable. If it wasn't testable, I wouldn't stand here for a microsecond. How many times have I sat with people and talked like I've talked to you tonight? I remember one lady in Christchurch who didn't want to stay and talk to folk after the service, but she left a note for me. I presented some of the things I mentioned tonight, and on her note it said, I lost my husband last week. This is the first hope I have begun to see. Doesn't solve the pain in the heart, ladies and gentlemen. But in my experience over life, the message of Christianity has done a very deep thing. It doesn't necessarily remove the scars, but it gives us hope because we can relate to a God who transcends sorrow and death. That's magnificent, you know. That's one of the reasons I'm a Christian. You see, Christianity doesn't compete with any other philosophy on this score because no other philosophy offers me this. There's no competition in that sense. Because the magnificent thing is this, that Christ promises hope. He promises salvation and peace. And he promises a world to come in which none of the ravages of either moral evil or pain will be apparent. Now, for many people that's utopian thinking. And we have to decide, on the basis of the evidence we've got, whether or not there is something to be said. I'm going to risk saying something. Perhaps I shouldn't risk saying it. I said that, and if my wife were here, she'd say it even more strongly than me, that we're going to end our lives with many unresolved questions along these lines. We'll never have tied them up completely because we don't know the whole story partly. But I sometimes wonder that when this heavens and earth have gone and there's a new heavens and a new earth, and we see what God has done with people who've suffered innocently, we'll have no more questions. Thank you.